Things. In the crystalline hush of the forest, a hunter crept among birch trees. The soft crunch of his boots on the snow was the only sound to interrupt the stillness of the morning. Even his breathing was steady and measured and nearly silent. All of a sudden, he caught out of the corner of his eye a glimpse of red gold. It was there and then gone. So he stole over the snow and found deer tracks embedded there. He followed the tracks over the landscape until he came to a narrow cave. And at the mouth of the cave were the ashes of a fire, and where the snow gave way to dirt were no longer hoof prints, but footprints. And the hunter crouched, gazing at the evidence on the ground, when from the mouth of the cave stepped a woman. She was dressed in a long white shift. Her eyes were the brown of rich loam, and her hair was a spill of squally red gold curls down her back. She was padding forward on bare feet, seeming impervious to the cold, humming to herself, laying new wood for a fire. The hunter stared, transfixed. Finally, he stood up and made to ask her name, but the moment he moved, her head snapped toward him. She dropped her armful of kindling, her eyes widened, and she leapt away. The hunter called out, "Wait, no!" But the moment her foot touched the snow line, there was the soft sound of falling leaves and the scent of juniper, and the woman was no longer a woman, but a doe. The hunter called out, "Wait!" again, but she bounded away. And so he gave chase and followed her for as long as he could, but soon it began to snow again, and her tracks were covered over. And soon the hunter became thoroughly lost. Now disoriented and stumbling, he wandered, still searching feverishly for the doe, trying to find her, but to no avail. And he was searching and becoming more and more confused, and as darkness approached, cold crept in, seeming to seep into his skin and freezing over his fingers. It was beginning to steal over all of him, and he might have frozen right there had it not been for the little thatched-roofed cottage and the glow of a fire inside. He stumbled toward it and fell upon the door, the thud of his body sufficing for a knock. When a surprised old woman opened the door, he fell in an ungainly sprawl into her cottage. He awoke to the light of the next day, warm but slightly achy, and the old woman sat rocking in the corner in a roughly hewn chair. She said, "Ah, he lives." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Thank you for sheltering me. I hardly know how I came to be here last night." She said, "Wasn't any trouble." He said, "How can I repay you?" She said, "Well, I could use some more firewood. You could save my back a little and attend to that." And the hunter readily agreed, and so he with his own axe set out to chopping enough wood to last the old woman the entire winter, until suddenly he seemed to remember something. He stiffened, and then his shoulders sagged. The old woman said, "What is it that troubles you? I can see you have a young heart that keens." He said, "Well, I saw a woman by the mouth of a cave, but when I approached her, she became a deer, a beautiful red gold thing, and she left before I could talk to her." The old woman said, "Ah, you have seen the Lady of Wild Things. She sees to the breath of the forest as the moon sees to the tides." "Lady of Wild Things," the hunter repeated. "How may I tame her?" The old woman grunted, raised an eyebrow. He said, please tell me, because I love her now, and I am ruined, for I must have her. And indeed, it was so, because this is a story, and that is how quickly people fall in love in stories. She said, if you must, I suppose I owe you that much for the extra firewood. Here's what you must do. I want you to find in this woods there is a single hickory tree. It is very old, it grows very slowly, and you will know it by the shaggy bark all around the trunk. You must climb to the top of this tree and go carefully. For the branches are brittle at this time of year, and it will be no fault of mine if you fall and snap your neck. Now, climb the tree and get to the very top and strip the very top of all of its bark until no pieces are left behind. And when you have done so, and there are no pieces left behind, climb down. Soak the bark in water to soften it and weave it into a hoop. Slip the hoop over the deer's head and she'll be yours. It's foolproof. The hunter thanked her and set off for the tree. And he was wandering around and looking and doing what hunters do, which is the searching and the finding of the things, until he came to the hickory tree. And there it was. It was beautiful. He knew it by the shaggy bark all around and saw that it stood some 30 feet high. Resolved, he heaved himself up onto a branch and began to climb. And he climbed until his arms were throbbing and he had reached a dizzying height where only a few spindly branches stuck out from the trunk, and knew that he had come to the top and had to do what he must do. And so with his knife, he stripped the top of the tree of all of its bark. And when he had collected all of it and no pieces were left behind, he slowly, carefully climbed back down. And then he borrowed a bucket from the old woman and got water from the stream and soaked the bark in the water until it was supple. And then he wove the bark into a hoop. He was very proud of himself. Armed with his hoop, he gave it a few experimental tosses into the air just to get the feel of it, and then set off to find the Lady of Wild Things. For a few hours, he did what hunters do, following the trails of the timberland creatures until he saw her there, a red gold thing poised in the center of a clearing. With a painful slowness, he approached, creeping toward her until he was within 10 feet of her. He swung the hoop back and tossed it with the practice of someone very, very good at horseshoes. And perhaps, if she had been an iron peg and the hoop had been a horseshoe, then he would have been successful. But, as it were, they both watched the graceful arc of the hoop as it rose, and she neatly sidestepped it as it fell. The Lady of Wild Things gave a flick of her ear and trotted away. Not to be deterred, the hunter decided to try a different tack. He set about blunting the point of an arrow. So he took an arrow and he ground it against a rock until it was dulled to a nub. And then he took a strip of leather from his boot and then he tied the hoop to the strip of leather. And if this were a different sort of story, then perhaps we might have several scenes with motivational music playing in which the hunter sends his arrow wildly astray until he really gets the hang of it, and then he can send the arrow exactly where he wants it with astonishing accuracy. But the truth of the story is that arrows were never meant to be fitted with hoops, hickory, or otherwise, and so the hunter spent several frustrating hours going to fetch his aerodynamically improbable contraption. And several times as he went fumbling after the arrow, he had the distinct feeling of being watched, but he could never be sure if the red gold that he saw out of the corner of his eye was real or if he had imagined it. He was almost certain that he had imagined the sound of snickering coming from a stand of nearby trees. And he really couldn't shake the feeling that a coterie of raccoons and squirrels was laughing at him. Perhaps, in a different story, they would have been. Regardless, the hunter was not to be deterred, and he figured that this tact was not working, and so he was going to try a different route. He went back and borrowed a length of rope from the old woman who had sheltered him, and he tied the rope around the hoop, and then he made his way back to the cave of the Lady of Wild Things. And then he took an awl, and he stuck the awl into a crevice at the top of the mouth of the cave, and then he laid the hoop that was tied to the rope at the foot of the cave, and he tossed the rope over it, and then he grabbed the other side and went to wait in the bushes over there. Certain that when the Lady of Wild Things approached, he could yank on the rope, and then it would send the hoop overhead and then fall directly onto her head. Foolproof. So, he gave a few experimental tugs, saw that this was going to be a beautiful plan, knelt in the brush, waited. And he waited. And his attention drifted to the fine sky and the daybirds soaring overhead. And even though the cold was bright and insistent, he found himself getting drowsier and drowsier, until finally he just fell asleep and his chin had just hit his chest when he was startled awake by the tug of the rope on his fingers. And he stood up and popped out of the brush, and there was one long strip of hickory hanging out from between the teeth of the deer. And on the floor were just shreds and shreds of his hickory hoop, and from the look of it, she had eaten most of the hoop. He cried out, "No, no, I need that!" And he lunged toward her, but as she had done in every single one of their interactions thus far, the Lady of Wild Things bounded away unconcerned. If he had been a different sort of hero, he might have noticed a pattern. Instead, he gathered up the shreds of hickory, and he went back to the old woman's house. He held them out to her where she sat, mending a boot. He said, "I failed." She said, "I can see that." He said, "Is there no other way? Is there no other magic? Is there no other tree?" She said, "I know no magic so forgiving as all that. That hickory tree grows alone." The hunter sank to his knees with his head in his hands. The old woman said, "Take heart, young man. You were never meant to tame the lady." He said, "I only wanted to be with her." The old woman paused, set down the boot. Now that is a different question, and a different sort of magic. Now there's no guarantee for this, but you may invite her in. Here's what you must do. Now, armed with his new set of instructions, the hunter set off for the trees again. With his axe, he found a stand of honey locust trees and began to chop down branches the length of his arms. Armed with his heavy bundle, he set off to find a place that was near, but not too near, the cave of the Lady of Wild Things. And then he began to clear a circle in the snow until he had revealed the wet bed of brown leaves below. And then he set the branches of the honey locust tree around until he had made most of a ring, leaving one branch lying out. And then, with more care and attention than he had before, he came into the center of the circle and sat down and waited. And if this were a different sort of story, he might have fallen asleep again to some comical effect. He might have never learned to love better, but he did. And so when the Lady of Wild Things approached, he only sat and nodded to her. She came forward on ginger hooves, her head tilted quizzically to the side, waiting for him to make some kind of aggressive move forward, but he didn't. He only waited. His breath caught in his chest, but still he made no move to touch her. Finally, she seemed to reach some sort of decision and stepped into the honey locust circle, and when she did, there was the sound of falling leaves and the scent of juniper, and before the hunter stood the lady. He said to her, "There or I, you're free to be, and I'll not order stay with me. But bid my antlers to be true, I will rise and go with you." She smiled broadly at him, and the late evening sun caught the red gold in her hair and seemed to set it aflame. She turned from the hunter, reached for the one outlying branch, and pulled it closer to close the circle. She turned back to him and stood and held out her hand to him. So he stood and took it. One breath in, and they both stepped out of the honey locust circle. The moment their feet touched the snow, there was the sound of falling leaves, the sense of juniper and pine, and out of the circle bound two deer, a doe and a stag, who went into the crystalline hush of the forest and onward toward the horizon. Perhaps, in a different story, they might have lived happily ever after. And perhaps